Hey, hey, hey. Okay, let's talk about the last two major types of tissue of the human body, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. So first up, muscle tissue. All right. So muscle tissue, we say that the muscle tissue is composed of muscle fibers. And so we're going to call the muscle cells of muscle tissue fibers, especially certain types of muscle tissue, because the muscle cells are elongated or long because they need to generate force, and they can generate more force if they're longer in length. Okay, and so we're talking about the contraction that happens, and it's a physically shortening up and pulling on something from one side to the other, okay? And so we call them fibers. And so this is a little confusing, I know, because we're talking about protein fibers, well, those aren't cells, right? But here we're saying muscle fibers. And so muscle fiber is synonymous, is the same as saying muscle cell. As we know, our muscle tissue provides a lot of functions, mainly motion, but it also provides heat, protection, helps us to maintain our posture. We're going to see that there's actually three different types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. Let's talk about the one that we think about when we say muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, right? So skeletal muscle tissue is talking about the tissue that makes up the muscle that is attached to your skeletal system, right? And these cells are, or fibers, are long, cylindrical, and they contain striations or stripes, okay, which is a striped appearance based on the organization of a couple of proteins within the cells. So due to protein organization in the cell. Okay, and then we're going to see that the cells are multi-nuclei, so they contain multiple nuclei. Okay, and we know that the function is voluntary movement. Okay, so you voluntarily move your body all different kinds of ways, right? You don't have it just happening kind of in autopilot. You are in control of your body and moving your body with your skeletal muscles. And then temperature regulation, that, yeah, the vast majority of heat that is produced by the body is produced by the contraction of our skeletal muscles. There is some heat produced by some deeper organs like our liver, for example, and our brain produces heat. But anytime there's work happening, a little bit of that energy is lost from that work that is being done. And so there's a lot of work in generating this force with our muscle tissue. And so a lot of heat is generated as a kind of an outcome of that. So let's look at the skeletal muscle tissue. We see, yes, that here we're looking at a little piece of a cool forearm muscle, and that we see that these are the muscle fibers that we see in this striped appearance, and that there are multiple nuclei. And we see that it does in fact have this striped appearance because of the orientation, the organization of proteins within these cells. Okay. All right, so let's look at the next type of muscle tissue, which is cardiac muscle. And so cardiac, as we know, cardiac means, gosh darn it, I always do that. Cardiac means heart, right? So this is the muscle tissue that makes up your heart. The cells are a little different. Here, the cells are branched, only one nucleus, per cell. They do have a striated or striped appearance though, just like skeletal muscle tissue. And we know that the main function is to contract, right? That there are these chambers that are lined with muscle tissue and they contract in a rhythm to pump the blood and maintain blood pressure throughout our body. And what's kind of neat is that there are many intercellular junctions going on here. I want to just point out that there are desmosomes to keep the cells connected to each other as the tissue is stretching. Right, as we talked about how blood does fill up in the chambers of the heart and expands the muscular walls. And so that muscle tissue is stretched out, but all those cells stay together because of those desmosomes. And then what's cool is there are gap junctions here because the electrical signal starts in one part of the heart and then it has to spread that electrical signal or the action potential to all the muscle cells so that they all get the signal to contract at the same time. Okay. All right. And here you can see that, yes, there are these little branchings that you see of individual muscle fiber cells. And then here's little intercellular connections between them called intercalated discs, and these intercalated discs contain these different intercellular junctions that we just talked about. The last type of muscle tissue is called smooth muscle tissue, and it is called that because it does not contain any striation, so it has a smooth appearance to it. Okay. We see here that the cells are short and kind of spindle shaped, as you see in this illustration. And we also see that there is just one nucleus per cell, okay, as indicated by these purplish kind of elongated blobs here within the individual cells. Okay, and so the function of smooth muscle tissue is the involuntary contraction and therefore involuntary movement of materials along our internal passageways in our body, okay? So this is involuntary contraction and therefore movement of materials along internal passageways. And so what kinds of material are we talking about? Food, urine, various cells and secretions in the reproductive system, mucus, blood, feces, right? All kinds of stuff that gets moved along by the involuntary contraction of this tissue, right? You're not telling your digestive tract to contract, right? It's doing it all on its own. So that's involuntary. All right, last major type of tissue, nervous tissue of the nervous system. Yes. So we know the main components of our nervous system, right? Our brain, our spinal cord, and then there's all these nerves outside of the brain and the spinal cord in the periphery of our bodies, running through our arms and our legs and running throughout our different cavities. These collectively are called the peripheral nerves. There are two cell types going on. Kind of two major categories, I should say. Okay, we have the neurons, and these are the ones that are excitatory, that they conduct nerve impulses or action potentials. These terms mean the same thing. right? This is the electrical signal that happens when they fire, right? And then there are all the support cells, and there's several different types. They're all gonna get lumped together in one category called neuroglia. And these are supportive and protective cells that do not conduct any nerve impulses or action potentials. They are there to help the neurons and support them in many different ways, but they themselves do not conduct nerve impulses, action potentials, okay? All right, so nervous tissue, this neurons, I wanna just look at basic structure of a neuron, okay? And that's what we see here in blue. This is a neuron. And a neuron has this basic, real general structure. This is a real basic one. They can be a little bit fancier, a little bit more intricate in their structure, but basic structure is that they have this cell body region here, okay? And then coming off the cell body are these little tree-like extensions that you see that are called dendrites, okay? And then coming off the cell body, we see this long kind of tube that then branches off. That is called the axon, okay? And so kind of the different parts are that the dendrites are these cytoplasmic extensions that receive information, receive signal from other cells, okay? The cell body contains the nucleus. We can see that. And this is kind of where the information goes. And so the cell body then decides on whether or not to conduct a nerve impulse or an action potential. I'll just call it a signal for now, just shorthand. And then if the cell body does decide, then the axon is the part where that electrical signal is conducted along the length of it. So the nerve impulse travels down the axon toward another cell, okay? So that electrical signal is communication that's traveling, and it's traveling from the very beginning of the axon and down, so it's going in that direction, down the length of the axon, and it goes off these branches. And then you can imagine that at the end of all these branches are another groups of cells, okay, that will then receive that information, that signal, okay? And we'll be going over the nervous system a couple of different times more in depth, okay? All right, let's check our understanding here. So, number one, what are the three types of loose connective tissue? Three types of loose connective tissue. So loose connective tissue, first of all, the class is what? Can you remember what class loose connective tissue falls into? Pause it, think about it. See if you can find the answer without looking at your notes. CT proper. Okay, so then the subclass within that is the loose CT. And that the three types, okay, are areolar, adipose, and reticular. Okay. All right, number two, one example of where we can find dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, there's at least 3 or 4 examples we talked about. Okay, so regular connective tissue. Again, that is regular dense, so dense regular. So that would be the subclass of dense in CT proper, right? So dense, remember there's dense regular and there's dense irregular. So think about how you're gonna keep all this sorted out. Making tables, making a big poster of it, you know, flow chart, graph, something, okay? So example, so that could be tendons. This is number 2, tendons, ligaments, aponeuroses, and then fascia are the examples. Okay, 3, main cell type we find in cartilage. Main cell type we find in cartilage is the chondroblast or chondrocyte. And then finally, number 4, which muscle fiber type is not striated? It does not contain the stripes. That would be smooth muscle fibers. All right. This is where I bid you adieu. I hope this was helpful. Happy studying. You can do it. Yes, you can. Thank you for listening. We'll see ya. Bye.